January 17, 1940. Chartres Airfield, France. The morning air bid exposed skin as ground crews move across the frozen tarmac, like ghosts through fog. Their breath came in clouds. Mechanics in oil-stained coveralls worked methodically, their hands numbed to spiked gloves, tightening bolts on aircraft that looked more like relics than instruments of war. In the distance, the low rumble of engines warming created a discordant symphony against the silence of the French countryside. And there, parked at the far end of the flight line, sat an aircraft that drew smirks and whispered jokes from nearly every pilot who passed it. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk. Its radial engine jutted forward like the snout of some stubborn, outdated beast. Its fixed landing gear stood planted on the ground with none of the sleek elegance that defined modern fighters. Compared to the Messerschmitt Bf-109s that German pilots flew with such confidence across the border, the Hawk looked like a farmer's plow horse standing beside thoroughbreds. French pilots called it Le Dinosaur. American advisors who'd come with the first shipments simply shrugged and admitted it was already obsolete before it left the factory floor. But on that frozen January morning, one pilot did not laugh. Lieutenant Jean-Francois Machat stood beside his assigned Hawk, running his gloved hand along its wing. The metal was cold enough to sting even through leather. He was 24 years old, dark-haired, with eyes that carried the particular weariness of a man who'd been told too many times that his equipment was insufficient, his training inadequate, and his chances slim. The French Air Force in early 1940 was a force caught between two eras, clinging to the glory of the Great War, while staring at the technological avalanche rolling toward them from Germany. Machat had read the intelligence reports. He knew what the Luftwaffe brought to the fight: speed, firepower, coordination, and pilots who'd already been bloodied in Spain. He knew the Bf-109 he could reach 350 miles per hour in level flight, while his Hawk struggled to break 300. He knew the German machine carried two 20mm cannons and two machine guns, while he had 4.30 caliber guns that felt more suitable for hunting rabbits than killing aircraft. What he also knew, what the others seemed to forget while they laughed, was that war was never only about the machine. It was about the man inside it. The Western Front in early 1940 existed in a strange state of suspended animation. Historians would later call it the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. After Hitler's invasion of Poland the previous September, Britain and France had declared war on Germany, then promptly did almost nothing along the Maginot Line. French soldiers sat in concrete fortifications and waited. In the air, patrols flew their patterns day after day, seeing little, engaging less. Both sides watched each other across the border like boxers in the opening second of a round, feet shuffling, neither willing to commit. But patrols still flew. Reconnaissance missions still launched. And on certain winter mornings when the fog lifted and visibility stretched to the horizon, fighters from both sides would occasionally find themselves sharing the same piece of sky. January 17th was such a morning. Machat's squadron received the order at dawn. Patrol Sector 7, altitude 4,000 meters, duration 90 minutes. Standard reconnaissance sweep. The briefing officer's voice carried the monotone quality of a man who'd given the same speech 100 times. No enemy activity expected. Maintain radio discipline. Return on schedule. 6 Hawks rolled down the runway in pairs, their radial engines coughing blue smoke into frozen air. Machat flew as number 4, tucked into formation, eyes scanning the horizon with the methodical discipline of a man who understood that survival came from seeing the enemy first. The world below them unfolded in winter browns and grays. Fields lay dormant under frost. Villages appeared as clusters of stone and slate roofs, sending thin columns of chimney smoke into the still air. The sun broke through scattered clouds and shafts of pale gold light that did nothing to warm the cockpit. At altitude, Machat's breath frosted on the inside of his canopy. He wiped it clear with his glove every few minutes, a ritual as automatic as checking his gauges. 20 minutes into the patrol, his squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio. Contact. 11 o'clock high. For aircraft, Machat's eyes snapped to the indicated position. There, perhaps 3 kilometers distant and 1,000 meters above them, for dark shapes moved against a cloud layer. Even at this distance, their silhouette was unmistakable. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the angular sharks of the Luftwaffe, hunting in their element. The German pilots had seen them too. What happened next would be analyzed in after-action reports, debated in officer clubs, and eventually recorded in the scattered documents that survived France's collapse. But in the moment itself, there was no time for analysis. There was only the sudden acceleration of heartbeat, the tightening of hands on control stick, and the split-second calculations that separated life from death. The Messerschmitt's Dove, German fighter tactics in 1940, were the product of hard lessons learned over Spanish skies. Luftwaffe pilots who'd flown with the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War had developed techniques that would dominate the early war years. The Finger Four formation, energy fighting, boom and zoom attacks. They fought as coordinated pairs, using altitude and speed to dictate the terms of engagement. The doctrine was simple and brutally effective. Stay high, stay fast, strike on the sun, never turn with the enemy. The four Messerschmitts descended on Machat's squadron like hawks on sparrows. Their superior altitude gave them speed, and speed was a currency of aerial combat. In the cockpits of those 109 sat pilots who knew, that their aircraft was the finest fighter in European skies. They'd heard about the outdated French planes, the slow moraines, the clumsy blocks, the American hand-me-downs with fixed landing gear and underpowered engines. This would be quick work. Led 109 pilot Lieutenant Karl Heinemann had 5 kills to his name, all scored during the Polish campaign. His wingman, Unteroffizier Franz Dietrich, had 3. They'd trained together, flown together, and hunted together across 2 fronts. As Heinemann pushed his stick forward and felt his fighter accelerate toward 400 miles per hour in the dive, he experienced a familiar surge of confidence that came from flying the best machine in the sky. The targeting reticle in his gun sight centered on the trailing French fighter, Machat's Hawk. At 500 meters range, Heinemann opened fire. The 20mm cannon shells and machine gun tracers created a stream of destruction that reached across the sky like a luminous whip. At this closing speed, the deflection was minimal. It should have been a killing shot, a textbook boom and zoom attack that would send the obsolete Hawk tumbling from the sky in flames. But the Hawk was no longer where Heinemann's gun sight said it should be. Machat had seen the muzzle flash and broken hard left at the exact instant Heinemann fired. The Curtiss Hawk, for all its obsolescence, had one quality that would prove significant that morning. It could turn. The fixed landing gear created drag, yes, but it also generated lift. The lightweight airframe and responsive controls gave it a turning radius that even a Bf 109 would struggle to match. Heinemann's burst passed through empty air. The German pilot's fighter blew past Machat's position at tremendous speed, committed to the dive, energy bleeding away as he pulled up to regain altitude for another pass. And in that moment, that brief window, when the 109 speed became a liability rather than an asset, Machat reversed his turn and squeezed his trigger, for .30 caliber machine guns hammered in his wings. The range was close, perhaps 150 meters, and closing. Machat had learned to shoot on hunting trips in Normandy before the war, tracking ducks and geese with his father's shotgun. The principle was the same. Lead the target, smooth trigger press. Let the target fly into your pattern. Tracers walked across the 109's fuselage. Heinemann felt the impacts as a series of sharp bangs through his airframe. One round punched through his canopy, missing his head by inches and showering him with plexiglass fragments. Another struck his coolant system, and immediately his temperature gauge began climbing toward the red line. White vapor streamed from beneath his cowling. His radio erupted with his wingman's voice. "Lead, you're hit. You're streaming coolant." Heinemann didn't need the announcement. He could see the temperature rising, feel the engine beginning to lose power. A Daimler-Benz engine without coolant had perhaps 5 minutes before it seized. He broke off the engagement, turning east toward German lines, nursing his damaged fighter home while his wingman covered his retreat. The obsolete Hawk had drawn first blood. The remaining Messerschmitts pressed the attack, but something had changed in the equation. The French pilots, emboldened by Machat's success and flying aircraft more maneuverable than they'd been given credit for, didn't run. They turned into the attacks, forcing the German pilots into turning fights where speed advantage meant nothing and energy tactics couldn't be employed. Dogfighting in 1940 was still an intimate affair. Aircraft closed at ranges where pilots could see each other's faces through canopies, where every movement of stick and rudder created immediate consequences, where instinct and reflexes mattered as much as technology. Mushat found himself locked in a scissors maneuver with Dietrich's 109, each aircraft reversing turn direction repeatedly, each pilot attempting to slide into firing position behind the other. The sky became a blur of horizon lines tilting and rotating. G-forces pressed Mushat into his seat during the hard reversals, grayed his vision at the edges, made his arms heavy as he muscled the stick through each turn. Dietrich was skilled. His aircraft was faster, but maneuverability belonged to the Hawk. On the fourth reversal, Mushat pulled his turn tighter than physics, said he should be able to, feeling the airframe shudder on the edge of a stall, and suddenly he was inside Dietrich's turn radius. The 109 slid into his gun sight like a gift. He fired. The range was perhaps 50 meters. Close enough to be certain, far enough to avoid debris. His tracers converged on the 109's wing route, and he saw fabric and metal tear away in chunks. Smoke poured from the engine. The German fighter rolled inverted, whether by choice or damage, Mushat couldn't tell, and dropped toward the earth trailing fire. Dietrich's voice in German that Mushat wouldn't understand screamed across the Luftwaffe frequency. Mayday! Mayday! I'm going down. The parachute deployed at 1,000 meters, a white flower blooming against the brown winter earth. The engagement lasted 7 minutes by the official clock. When it ended, the sky over Sector 7 was empty except for Mushat's squadron regrouping in formation. 2 Messerschmitt pilots were limping back to their base with damaged aircraft. One was descending under a parachute toward French territory and a POW camp. The fourth had disengaged and fled rather than face aircraft he'd been told were obsolete. 6 outdated Hawks returned to Chartres airfield without loss. The ground crew saw them coming, saw the gun barrels stained with powder residue, and knew something had changed. By the time the pilots climbed from their cockpits, word was already spreading through the base. The obsolete fighters had fought Messerschmitts and won. Mushat stood beside his Hawk as mechanics swarmed over it, checking for damage, refueling, reloading ammunition. His hands trembled slightly, adrenaline aftermath, and he kept them in his pockets so the younger pilots wouldn't see. His crew chief, a gap-toothed sergeant from Lyon who'd been working on aircraft since the Great War, approached with a grin. To confirm, Lieutenant, not bad for a dinosaur. Mushat looked at his aircraft, at the worn paint and the oil stains and the fixed landing gear that everyone mocked. He thought about the German pilots who'd attacked them with such confidence, certain of their technological superiority, only to discover that the equation contained variables they hadn't calculated. It's not the machine, he said quietly. It's never just a machine. The intelligence reports from January 17, 1940, created ripples that extended far beyond a single engagement. When Luftwaffe commanders reviewed the after-action debriefs from Heinemann and the surviving pilots, they faced an uncomfortable truth. Their pilots had expected an easy victory against obsolete aircraft and instead had been outfought. German tactical doctrine was built on assumptions of superiority, technological, tactical, and psychological. The Messerschmitt was faster, the pilots better trained, the tactics more modern. Victory should have been assured. But doctrine doesn't account for determination. It doesn't measure the advantage held by pilots fighting over their own territory, defending their own homes, fly with particular desperation of men who know defeat means occupation. The Luftwaffe pilots that morning had been hunting. Mushat and his squadron had been defending. There is a difference. Throughout the spring of 1940, as the phony war dragged toward its violent conclusion, the P-36 Hawks continued to fly. They were outnumbered, outperformed, and outgunned by nearly every measure. When the German invasion of France finally came in May, the Hawks were swept aside by the sheer overwhelming force of the Blitzkrieg. But they fought. Curtiss Hawk pilots scored dozens of confirmed kills during the Battle of France. They flew ground attack missions against German columns when no other aircraft were available. They escorted bombers, defended cities, and died in cockpits of aircraft that everyone had said were already obsolete. The official French records, scattered and incomplete after the nation's collapse, credit P 36 pilots with approximately 230 confirmed aerial victories during the Battle of France. A remarkable total for an aircraft that had been dismissed as a relic before the war even began properly. Mushat himself would survive France's defeat. He would escape to Britain, join the Free French forces, and eventually fly Spitfires with the RAF. He would shoot down 3 more German aircraft over England before his death in 1943. But he never forgot the lesson of that January morning over Sector 7. That wars are won not by machines alone, but by the men who fly them and the reasons they choose to fight. In the scattered documents that survived the war, there exists a letter written by Lieutenant Karl Heinemann to his brother in March 1940. 2 months after his encounter with Mushat's squadron, Heinemann had recovered from minor injuries sustained during his emergency landing and returned to combat duties. But something in his writing had changed. "We were told the French Air Force was finished before we even began," he wrote. "We were shown performance specifications and tactical assessments that proved our superiority beyond question. What we were not told, what no specification can measure, is what a man will do when fighting for his home rather than for conquest. The Kurdish fighters we engaged should not have been a threat. On paper, they were obsolete. In reality, they were flown by pilots who understood something we have forgotten. That desperation can overcome disadvantage, and that courage can sometimes equal horsepower. I do not know if we will meet those same pilots again, but I no longer assume that victory is assured simply because our machines are faster." The letter was discovered in a shoebox in a Berlin apartment in 1947, part of a collection of personal effects returned to Heinemann's family after he was killed over Stalingrad in 1942. It offers a rare glimpse into the psychological impact of encountering unexpectedly fierce resistance from supposedly inferior opponents, a recurring theme throughout Germany's war that would eventually contribute to their defeat. The Germans had built a military doctrine on the assumption that technological superiority and tactical excellence would inevitably triumph. They had not accounted for the possibility that their opponents might refuse to accept the verdict of the specification sheet, might choose to fight even when the rational calculation suggested surrender. This was the first crack in the myth of invincibility. The symbolic weight of the P-36 Hawk extends beyond its combat record. Here was an aircraft that represented everything critics said America couldn't do. It arrived late, underperformed specifications, and was obsolete before delivery. Yet in the hands of determined pilots, it became something more than the sum of its components. Consider what it meant to the German pilots who faced it. They had been told that the democracies were weak, that their economies were inefficient, that their people lacked the will to fight. They expected to sweep aside French resistance as easily as they crushed Poland. Instead, they found themselves in turning fights with obsolete aircraft flown by pilots who should have been intimidated but weren't. Every P-36 that climbed to meet them was a refutation of the ideology they'd been taught. Every obsolete Hawk that scored a kill was evidence that the equation wasn't as simple as their commanders claimed. If outdated American exports flown by supposedly demoralized French pilots could challenge the Luftwaffe's finest, what would happen when America itself entered the war with modern equipment and fresh pilots? The question haunted German tactical planning for the remainder of the conflict. By late 1943, when American P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into German territory, the Luftwaffe faced aircraft that were superior to their own in nearly every measurable category. The technological advantage they'd enjoyed in 1940 had evaporated. The Americans had learned, adapted, and innovated with the particular ruthless efficiency of an industrial democracy fully mobilized. But it had started with the obsolete Hawks over France, with pilots who refused to accept the limitations of their equipment and chose to fight anyway. There is a photograph that survives from Chartres Airfield, dated February 1940. It shows a group of French pilots standing in front of a P-36 Hawk, and if you know where to look, you can spot Lieutenant Mushat in the second row, fourth from the left. He is not smiling, none of them are. They have the look of men who understand what's coming, who know that the phony war cannot last forever, that the hammer is about to fall. Behind them, the Hawk sits on his fixed landing gear, nose pointed toward a sky that would soon be filled with fire and smoke and falling aircraft. Someone has painted a small German cross beneath the cockpit. Mushat's first 2 kills. The paint is fresh. It will weather quickly in the coming weeks as more crosses are added, then fade entirely when France falls and the aircraft is destroyed to prevent its capture. But on that February morning, the pain is still fresh, and the possibility of victory still exists, and a group of pilots stand in front of an obsolete aircraft that has proven to be more than anyone expected. Wars are not won by men who accept the limitations imposed on them. They are won by those who find ways to exceed those limitations, who discover advantages where none were supposed to exist, who refuse to surrender even when the rational calculation says they should. The P-36 Hawk was slow. It was outgunned. It was obsolete before the first shot was fired. But it was also flown by men who didn't care about specifications, who understood that combat is rarely a fair comparison performance charts, and who climbed into their cockpits each morning knowing that survival required outthinking and outfighting opponents in superior machines. They laughed at the outdated fighter. They mocked its fixed landing gear and its radial engine and its inadequate armament. They calculated performance differential and concluded that it had no chance against modern Messerschmitts. And then the radio calls started going silent. On September 7, 1943, the BBC broadcast a brief announcement that a free French pilot named Jean-François Machat had been killed in action during a fighter sweep over the English Channel. His Spitfire had been hit by anti-aircraft fire and went down into the cold gray water. He was 28 years old. The announcement mentioned that Flight Lieutenant Machat had scored 6 confirmed aerial victories during his service with the RAF and the Free French Air Force. It did not mention that 2 of those victories had been scored in an aircraft everyone said was obsolete during a war that everyone said was already lost against an enemy that everyone said was invincible. But his crew chief from Chartres Airfield remembered. The mechanic, having survived the war, would tell the story to anyone who would listen. How a young lieutenant had climbed into a dinosaur of fighter and proven that wars are won not by machines but by the men inside them and by the reasons those men choose to fight. The Hawk was slow, yes, but it could turn. And sometimes, in wars in life, the ability to change direction matters more than the ability to go fast in a straight line. The Germans learned this lesson over France in 1940. They would learn it again over Britain later that year. And they would continue learning it, in progressively more painful installments, until the industrial might and determined population of the democracies they dismissed as weak had ground their war machine into dust. It started with an obsolete fighter and a pilot who refused to accept what the specifications said was inevitable. That refusal, that stubborn insistence on fighting despite the odds, would eventually become the epitome of the Allied war effort. From the beaches of Dunkirk to the forests of the Ardennes to the ruins of Berlin, the story was the same. Democratic peoples who were supposed to be soft and undisciplined proving harder and more resilient than the ideologies that had dismissed them. The P-36 Hawk was not a great aircraft, but it was good enough in the hands of men who were fighting for something greater than conquest. And in the end, good enough was all it needed to be.